Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do. To educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade Teta, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level. Welcome to the podcast, everybody. Today we are talking politics. I know. Everyone's going to get an uproar about this, right? Why is it that we cannot have conversations about politics when politics are so substantial to how we manage the world? We have got to learn to have these conversations. So from my perspective, and I know many of you, this bothers, and frankly, I don't care, sorry, but we have to have and learn to have difficult conversations. We need to be able to learn to disagree. We need to be able to learn from people. We need to be able to learn to say we're wrong or to hear different perspectives. That's how we grow and get better. So today on the podcast, I have one of my very good friends who also happens to be someone who is very well versed in psychology, philosophy, and specifically politics. She's going to be breaking down some differences for us in terms of definitions. She's going to be bringing us through a conversation about different things that get us all up in arms. And you're also just going to see us really just having the kinds of conversations that the two of us often have when we are together. And you'll see there are some real differences here. Some of you are going to get very triggered by her. Some of you are going to get very triggered by me. Some of you are going to find lots and lots to love and about what Courtney's saying. Some of you are going to find lots to love about what I'm saying. Of course, there's going to be hate on both sides as well. That is the whole point. This discussion really is a learning discussion, yes, but it's really just about all sitting back, no matter where you come from on the political spectrum, and just listening to the conversation. Trust me, this is going to trigger you. It's part of what politics does. The more you become a better next level human, and remember, none of us are next level humans. We're all becoming next level humans. So to be more in that process means sitting and listening and being uncomfortable with people who have different opinions and viewpoints than us, which you're going to run into in this conversation, either from me or Courtney. And I would just say, sit back, relax, try to listen to the conversation and follow along. And this is going to be part 1 of either 2 or 3 parts on politics with Courtney. I really hope that you will stick around for this. I think it is extremely important, and I really hope you enjoy today's show. All right, welcome everybody. So today I have a very good friend of mine, and the reason I brought her on, Courtenay Turner. How are you, my friend?
I'm well, thank you.
I'm so glad you're here. The reason I brought her on is because we're going to talk about a topic today that for a lot of you is probably going to, I don't know, when you first hear the topic we're going to discuss, you might get a little prickly. You're going to get on edge because we're talking politics. And here's the thing to sort of know. I'm sort of an amateur at this in terms of definitions and sort of the deep dive, like, how do we know if we're liberal? How do we know if we're conservative? What are the stances? All these kind of things that we all think we know, but we really don't know. And whenever I have those questions, Courtney is the one that I go to. And I do think, before I start giving her the chance to tell you a little bit about how she has this expertise, I personally believe, and I think Courtney shares this belief, although she can correct me if she doesn't, but I personally believe, as being a next level human, you have to talk about politics, and you need to do it in a way that is not so divisive and argumentative, and more just come from a place of let me understand the different sides, have some discourse so we can decide what is the best course of action to take. I am very sort of against this sort of one size dogmatic bias based approaches. I love the idea that we have sort of two different parties. I wish there were five or six different parties, to be honest with you, in the United States, but I like the discourse. And so we're going to talk politics. So, Courtney, why don't you just briefly walk us through sort of your background in this arena, just so people kind of get a sense of sort of who you are and sort of why you're the person that I always go to for this information.
All right. Well, I will say I really love that you bring up discourse. My interest in politics it's derived mostly from my interest in the human experience. I have a really strong background in psychology, philosophy, metaphysical studies, like from, studying. I always think about it like, we look at who we are as individuals, and then we look at our place in the world, our relationship to other people, and then the world around us. And then, as a child, I had a very strong interest in metaphysical, astronomy, astrophysics. And I think they are really all intertwined. I look at politics, which I know a lot of people see as being really controversial, but I think politics are really the way that human beings can coexist in a civilized society.
Yeah.
And it's really the understanding of the economic and social policies that lead to that. Yeah. And so that's where my interest comes from. I did write for a political blog. It was called Politichicks. I did a lot of, interviewing journalism in that arena. So yeah, well,
yeah, I like what you said, because to me, I see it the same way. I'm a sort of a philosophy and psychology geek, and to me, if you're going to merge those two things, social systems and markets and all this kind of stuff, politics is really the place where all these things kind of merge. So it makes sense that people like you and I, who are into psychology and philosophy, would also be interested in talking about politics. So I'm going to start.
And
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. I was just going to start with sort of the simple things. And one of the reasons that I want to do this is because I usually talk to Courtney, and Courtney is really wonderful with me. She's very patient with me. And she'll usually point out, she'll say something like, well, the left leaning, sort of media, or you have to be careful about the conservative this or that, and she's basically always prompting me not to go too far in either direction. At least that's what it feels like when she's sort of educating me. And so I wanted to start with some of these definitions that I wasn't as clear on, that I think Courtney can sort of square away from us. So let's start with this idea of liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican. I guess liberal, conservative, I think, is a little more broad for people who are listening outside of the United States. Here in the United States, we have this two-party system, Democrat, Republican, and we usually talk about them as sort of liberal and conservative. So can you just help us understand what we actually mean when we're saying these things?
Totally. And I understand why it gets very confusing, because left and right in this country are different than what left and right are in other countries, even Europe, which we think of as somewhat similar. And the term left and right actually came from right after the French Revolution in 1789, I believe it was. But it was actually where the parliament sat, left versus right. And that identified like the revolutionaries versus the established aristocracy. So it does model itself somewhat in this country. Typically, the people on the left, and right now we're seeing a lot of the Democrats are more left-leaning, but it's a large spectrum certainly. And leftist is usually anywhere from socialism, communism, fascism, totalitarianism. But the basic core principle is that they believe in more government. They want government to solve the problems that we face as humanity. Then we go into the right. The right has a wide spectrum, and this is where things get a little bit confusing, because as you move kind of more center right, that's typically what was known as classical liberal. The modern liberals that we see today are more like neo-Marxist, cultural Marxist, social liberals. And that's more akin to what we see on the left with Democrats today. Right. But on the right, the conservatives, we'll call them, tend to comprise of the classical liberals, libertarians, and they're more of that school of thought. They want less government, more individual freedom, less regulations. Those kind of very broad strokes. Certainly, we see, you go too far on either end of the spectrum, and good things don't happen, and we've certainly seen that throughout history.
Yeah, and this is where it gets a little confusing for me, and I love sort of the way you frame that, because when I think about democratic, see, I think I'm sort of middle left, right? So I'm slightly left, and mostly socially, I would say I'm socially liberal. And what I mean by that, and I just want to see if I have these definitions correct. This is why I'm asking. I consider myself socially liberal because I'm for sort of equal opportunity. I don't like the idea of. I think everyone should be able to have the ability to do what they want. I'm very for gay rights. I'm very for anything that allows someone to be who they are in the world without the government sort of regulating that. And I tend to think, when I think of conservative, I tend to think of people who are trying to legislate that and keep those people from sort of being free to do what they want. And I know that this is a huge topic of debate, and I want to know, so how does that work? Because when you said conservative, it's sort of like, okay, so these are the libertarians, these are the people who sort of less government, more freedom. But I oftentimes think of, sort of myself being socially liberal, that I don't really care sort of what you do. A woman is in charge of her body. I think black and white should be equal. I have no problem with who you are sexually interested in, and nor do I want to legislate that in any way. And I oftentimes feel like sort of the conservative, which it seemed to say you were saying they want, less government, more freedom, seem to want to legislate that, whereas the social liberals, which I feel like are more Democrat right now, seem not to. So, and I know this is just one small segment of this discussion, but I figured, but I want to sort of just clear that up. Do I have that right? And how do we sort of see that?
So, and that is really interesting, and I understand exactly where the confusion comes from. So let me see how I can, without going through hundreds, if not thousands of years of history, explain this, because it is actually very, very relevant today for a lot of reasons. And, I can go into a little bit more of this later because it's a lot to unpack. But we're seeing a lot of it because we're seeing a lot of the tenets of the Frankfurt School and cultural Marxism, which is kind of a merge of the socialist theory of Marx, which is more of an economic principle that merges with the postmodern kind of philosophy. And we're seeing a lot of that right now. And that's really where you get the social justice warriors, which is kind of what you're talking about when you say you're socially liberal, is that you want all these freedoms for these people who are of minority sex, we'll call them. Right now that's what they're labeling that as like identity politics, intersectional politics. Here's where I think it gets really confusing. Really, if you go to the right, they don't want the government involved in people being people. I think one thing the postmodernists actually did get right is that I think Western civilization really capitalized on this, but postmodernists talk about, there's an infinite number of interpretations. So, essentially there's an infinite number of groups, right? Yeah. Western civilization realized that the ultimate minority was the individual.
Yeah.
And that's really, this country was founded on principles of Western civilization. So really it's the right who doesn't want to, if you go super far extreme right, I would say that's like almost nihilistic. There's no government. And that's really like extreme libertarianism. I'm not saying libertarians all think that way, but that's the extreme end of the spectrum, is where they want no government policy on individuals. Individuals, just jungle law, basically. And the left, what they're doing is, it looks like it's coming from a place of compassion for these minority groups. And that's certainly what a lot of the, I hate to use this word because it has such a pejorative connotation, but the propaganda, essentially, because there is messaging, there's always messaging, right? Is that we're protecting these groups. But the problem is that they don't protect those groups, because how do you protect those groups? They do it by legislating on them. And that's really democratic policies that are doing that. And I think it's really interesting when you look at the psychological literature on politics, because there's agreeableness is a really high predictor of whether or not you're going to be liberal or conservative. There are actually many of the big five traits
Yeah,
that really do.
I was
So,
gonna bring that up, but I'm glad you're bringing it up. Yeah.
okay, sorry.
Yeah,
do,
no,
you,
that's
do you want
great.
me to wait on
No, I want you
that?
to
Okay.
go in whatever direction you want.
So I think it's very interesting because I think it's certainly relevant to what we're seeing with a lot of the social justice warriors
Mm,
is that agreeableness being one of those traits. Agreeableness actually bifurcates into compassion and politeness.
mm,
And the liberals are certainly very high on the compassion scale. And I'll talk a little bit about that and explain how it relates to the social justice warriors, in my opinion. And then the conservatives are very high on politeness. And we see this too, because one of the core tenets of the left versus the right is in how do we effectuate change.
mm,
And so the left believes in the traditional kind of, Marxist revolutionary type theory that there must be revolution. And usually that's violence in order to have change occur.
mm,
The right believes in reform. A lot of people think that conservatives are, very traditional and they just want to protect the traditional order.
mm.
But really, it's really this notion of ordered liberty. That's really what they want. And Edmund Burke has a great quote that sums this up. He says that you must reform in order to conserve,
Mm.
which, if you think about that logically, makes perfect sense. You can't just hold on to the uh, tradition because you're in, hundreds of years later, society is very different. So you
Yeah.
have to reform in order to uphold those values. But I'll get back to the agreeableness.
Mm,
Agreeableness, which bifurcates. So the liberals are very high on compassion. And we think of that as being kind of like meek and, they're empathetic. And the empathy part might be true, but really compassion is a genetic component and it's higher typically in female because of the nurturing components they need for raising an infant.
yeah.
So when you think about that, they're very empathetic and sensitive to the infant. However, and that's, a very vulnerable creature, which is what you think of these minority groups. A lot of times we think of them that way, right? But here's the thing: if you were to threaten an infant, what is the mother going to do? They're going to be a mama bear, right?
Yeah,
They're going to come
absolutely.
out. They're not docile. They're not compassionate to you. They're very compassionate to those they're protecting, and that's what we're seeing with a lot of these social justice warriors. Is instead of really just letting these people be who they are, which is I certainly think that that is how we should operate. Everybody, the individual has a great value and importance. That's what Western civilization was founded upon.
Mm,
But legislating on top of them actually um, it constrains them and it hurts them.
mm.
But so that is how some of the psychology, and I can go into the other components if you
Well,
want.
actually, yeah, I love that because I want to sort of ask from this perspective, and it seems like there might be some overlap then here. If I'm hearing you correctly, I'm just going to repeat because I think it's important. By the way, when you're learning some of this, for some of you, this is going to sound like Greek, and it does to me sometimes when Courtney's educating, me in terms of
Sorry.
certain things I do. So I like to repeat back to her. And she also knows I push back pretty strong at times because I have,
Yeah,
sort of my own beliefs, which is, part of it. And that's why I like having discourse with her because it's a debate, not an argument. But so the way I see this,
yeah.
if I'm hearing you correctly, you're essentially saying the left oftentimes likes to or wants to legislate. Into these groups to protect these groups, and it's partly because they're compassionate towards their in group. But you're essentially saying they're not always compassionate to what would be considered sort of the out group or where they see the wrong sort of group. And so if you're sort of on the
Those
conservative,
wronging the group they're protecting. Yeah.
right, wronging whoever they're
Not
protecting.
compassion to those who think. Yeah.
Right.
Sorry.
And so from that perspective, if you're sort of conservative leaning then, and you're sort of like, I want government the least involved possible in this, you would see that as a bad thing, not potentially, not like maybe someone on the left might be thinking, oh, they're against me, but more that a conservative might be seeing it as like, you think this is serving you, but in the end, it's not because government's going to have too much control over you. So is that sort of what you're saying there?
Yes, that is
Okay.
what I'm saying. But And and we can get to this later, but that has a lot to do with this. They're trying to level the playing field,
Mm,
and that's a lot of where the government steps in to try and help out these supposed minority groups, right?
yeah. Mhm.
And yeah, it doesn't always work out quite the way we would like it
Yeah,
to.
I definitely want to get there because that's part of the major reason I wanted to talk with you. But so the other side of this then is how do we then explain groups that I would consider conservative, sort of on the right, who want to legislate things like abortion and want to legislate sort of other things to control people and want to, overreach as far as some people might be concerned in terms of putting religion into schools, specifically Christianity and these kinds of things. And so to me, that seems very much the exact same thing going on over here on the right as you're saying is going over here on the left. And is that true? And is it essentially a matter of, being a pure conservative or a pure liberal and sort of getting mixed up in between? Because I do see that the same exact thing is going on on the left or on the right rather, which is what gets me sort of riled up because I'm like, the more it's like you're saying you don't want government involved, but you certainly want them to legislate your religion. You certainly want to tell a woman what she can do with her body. You certainly want to have some of these, government involved in these, sort of what I would call personal choices. So to me, how do you square that? Because that sounds like the exact same argument that is being leveled on to the people on the left by the people on the right.
Totally understand that. So it is interesting because there it is a spectrum, right? And typically people don't fall into nice little boxes,
Yeah.
as you very well know. We want them to. That's what we'd like because as human beings we want a certain degree of order,
Yeah.
and we want to make sense of things. And the way we do that is trying to put things and people into boxes, which doesn't work. And it doesn't work with politics either because it is a spectrum and there's so many schools of thought. So, when you had asked me initially about like, can you define capitalism? Can you define democracy? Can you define socialism? And certainly I could, probably not in an hour, because there's, I really tried. I
Yeah.
did. Um, but there's many different types, right? And a lot of people think of the United States as being a democracy. It is not a true democracy.
Mm,
Democracy comes from the Greeks, demos, kratia.
mm,
It's people rule. And actually, our founding fathers were really against democracy, a true democracy,
mm.
rather, because they thought that would lead to mob rule.
Yeah.
And we're seeing a little bit of that today, to be
Mm,
quite honest.
mm,
And it was an understandable fear, especially the larger the population gets. True democracy is, or direct democracy is where the people have a direct vote on their representatives or direct vote on policy. And the municipal level, we may see some of that. We do have some true democracy in very small sections of this country, but not national scale. What we are is a constitutional republic.
mm.
So when you talked about the right wanting to the right side of the political spectrum, and certainly the I would say like the classical liberal side of the right,
Mhm.
definitely does want to impose some sort of legislation on order that's aligned with the Constitution that we have in this country.
Mm.
So when you look at the Constitution, there are lots of things like the Bill of Rights, like we need to have freedom of speech. There's separation of church and state.
Mm.
So that is the reason why there are some sorts of sanctions and protections for people to have religious freedom or freedom from religion.
Mhm.
So the things that the right wants to, and I'm not talking about Democrats and Republicans necessarily. We're
Yeah,
talking
I
more
understand that. Yeah.
philosophically speaking, because deep state, that's a whole nother conversation. People who are in politics have their own agenda. They're
Yeah.
human. We'd like to think that they're truly representing our best interests, but that doesn't always happen.
Yeah.
So when you talk about it, though, more philosophically speaking, the people who are more classical liberals, who are, I would say, aligned with Western culture, Western civilization that the founding fathers instituted when they created the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and set up this country. They recognized that there was a code of laws that we do have capitalism in the sense of free market, individuality, dictate and competition dictating things, but there are regulations on that.
Mm.
It has to be in accordance with our Constitution. So
Yeah. And there's always a
that's my
battle.
answer.
Yeah, no, I understand, and I think it's important as people are listening, and I'm listening to this, right? One of the things I think is important, you said, look, I'm not talking about Democrat, Republican, I'm talking about philosophically speaking, and this is a hard thing for people to do because as soon as they start hearing these arguments, they immediately want to counter argue based on the team that they're coming from, and I think I would stop here and just say, everyone, stop if you're doing that right now, and just realize that all we really want to do is just hear these philosophical sort of differences. And part of the reason I was just sort of throwing that in is throwing these different things in is just to further that discussion. So again, always try to resist the temptation to be like, oh, Jade's a certain way or Courtney's a certain way or, ooh, I need to be on my team. It's just, we're just sort of having this discussion now. And so to me, it's useful. And I think we have to, you and I should probably do like 2 more of these because, it's almost
I
impossible
would love
to,
it.
yeah, to teach this kind of stuff and have these discussions in a nuanced way without some of the background. But what I want to do is based on that discussion, then, so I want to um, go into this discussion that I was asking you about, you and I were texting back and forth about, and this is this idea of equality and sort of equality of opportunity, and then equity, and whether that's synonymous with equal outcome, and what is this difference between equal opportunity and equal outcome, and maybe even where would the classical, we don't even have to talk Democrat, Republican, but where would the classical liberal conservative sort of come down on this. But I think it's really important that people understand, because for me, and this is just where I'll open myself up to criticism and everybody being mad at me here, I am staunchly equal opportunity. I want to do everything that I can to give everybody sort of equality, and I'm very much for equal rights. I give to the ACLU every month, and I've been doing that for about the American Civil Liberties Union. I give to the NAACP for a little while. This is going to get some people very mad at me, but the reason I do that is because I'm very much for leveling the playing field. I feel like equal opportunity is very important to me. However, I am not for equal outcome. And I'm going to express what my understanding of this, and then let Courtney say, Jade, you're right about your understanding of that or wrong about your understanding of that. But here's how I see this. I see this as like, if I go into, I'm a white male, and I go to a job, and I am up against a female Asian, a black male, and Courtney, let's say, for the job, right? So there's 4 of us up for the job, and sort of 2 minorities. Obviously I'm the white male here, so it's like male, then white female, then Asian female, then black male, right? So to me, I'm like, if I'm the most qualified of those 4 individuals, I should get the job regardless of representation in that business. That's how I feel, because I feel that way very strongly, because I feel it opens up a can of worms that serves nobody, including the minorities there, if we don't do that. However, I also feel very strongly, if we're all equally qualified, then I should be the last one to get that job in order to essentially equalize the opportunity and have representation. So that's what I feel. Equal opportunity, meaning we're all equally qualified. They've got enough white males. They've probably got enough white females. What they don't have is perhaps black males and Asian females. So to me, I would say they should get that particular job. However, if I'm the more qualified out of the 4, I should always get that job. And I know that opens up a lot of questions for everyone about, well, what about equal opportunity of education and blah, blah, blah. But that's sort of my stand on this. And I want to just know, am I getting that right in those definitions? Is that a good example, a bad example? And how do we make sense of this?
Okay, there is a lot to unpack here. So I'm going to do my best to do this without, talking forever. And also, yeah, I will do my best.
Okay.
So let's start. right. We'll start with equal opportunity and equal and equity. How about we'll start there? So
now,
equity
is equity and equal outcome, are those synonymous? Are those essentially the same words? Okay.
They are synonymous.
Okay.
Yes. So one thing that I will just start with that you said, because I think this is a little bit confusing for people, and I think this is a little bit where you've conflated the 2 a bit.
Okay. Cool.
Is that you want equal opportunity, which is equality, right? However, you also said you want equal outcome. in a sense, because you want to level the playing field. You can't level the playing field. You can give people an opportunity to enter the game, but you can't level the playing field without trying to impose equity, which is equal outcome. And there are many problems. There's, people critique capitalism because it does breed inequality. It absolutely does. However, it is, in my estimation, it's the best system that we have compared to all the rest.
Yeah, it's often been said it's the best system of a bunch of crappy systems, including capitalism.
Right. Or a better way of putting it is, it's the worst system possible, except all the others.
Yeah, exactly.
That might be a way of looking at it. However, I will just back up a little bit, and I'll just give you this from my perspective. This is just my opinion, but when I look at, and I think this is a fundamental worldview difference between the left and the right, is that I think that the left has a very Rousseauian, the philosopher Rousseau, very romanticized opinion of human nature, that we are inherently good and that it is society that has corrupted us, society that is oppressing us and bringing out the malevolence in humanity. And then there is the right view, politically right, I'm assuming right, but there is the politically right view, which is that human nature is inherently flawed. There is tremendous evil within each of us, which then breeds evil interpersonally and in the world. That is not to say that I think, or that, they think that human beings are all evil. We're certainly not. We can do a lot of good. However, I don't think it's the job of society. I don't think society oppresses us. I think it's the job, this is why I'm interested in politics, because I think it's the job of societal structures to try and bring out the best in us, because even the most malevolent of creatures will do more good than harm if he's incentivized to do so. And I think that's what capitalism does. It incentivizes people to do good. It is not perfect, and it does breed inequality. However, we haven't found a system that doesn't breed inequality, because you look at the flip side of it, which is the socialist, philosophy. They're trying to level the playing field, except what happens is you end up having rule, tyranny. Socialism always leads to communism or fascism or totalitarianism. So you don't really have, complete egalitarianism unless you look through history. Certainly if we want to look at the gulags in Russia, or, the concentration camps in Germany, there's certainly egalitarianism there. But is that the kind we want? That all resulted in death. So, yeah, if you're starving and dying, we can say there might be, equality of outcome there, but that's not necessarily what we're striving for, I don't think. So I'll get back to some of the points that you were.
Well, let me just make. We can go. You don't have to touch on all of them, because I know it's almost impossible to do. But let me go back to this sort of idea, which I would say I disagree with. Which is fine, because we do this on occasion. But this idea that socialism always leads to, sort of negative outcomes. One of the things that I have, I'm a very evidence-based. What's that?
Okay. Yeah.
I'm sort of okay. I'll go. I'm sort of an evidence-based guy. So when I look at some what are considered socialist countries, so I kind of go like this, right? Politics. I go, who out there has the happiest people? Okay, we have data on this, right? Who has the happiest people? Who has the healthiest people? Who has the a good balance of entrepreneurial spirit and capitalism and free market societies, and seems to be having these robust economies. And to me, when I look at those countries, I go, okay, well, that's Denmark, that's Norway, that's Finland, that's Sweden, that's New Zealand. That's some of these countries who have great outcomes in health, great outcomes in happiness, and great sort of robust economies. And so then I go, well, to someone on the right, the right conservative sort of side of things, these countries look very socialist. And to me, I go, even in the United States, we're somewhat socialist, Medicare and Medicaid, Social Security. These are socialist things. So to me, one of the things that I've always thought is, why do we even have to make this distinction when, to me, it's sort of the merging of the best sides of each of these, free market capitalism with sort of social, safety nets seem to be the best that we have. Yet, if we jump on these things where we say socialism is bad, let's say, I mean, obviously Bernie Sanders, turned that around where he's saying I'm a socialist. He kind of admitted it, and in a sense, to me, I see those as sort of a good thing, and I do see that they have more equal sort of opportunity there as well. And one of the things I'll point out about that is that, and this will go probably to your point, when it comes to equal outcome, one of the things I feel like I know, and this might be wrong, is that as they've tried to equalize, like get all the women into the engineering field, let's say, in like a place like Norway, and try to get more men into the nursing field and have like equal distributions, what they're finding is women don't want to go into engineering and men don't want to go into nursing. And so when I first started seeing this, I was like, oh, this might be sort of the limits on this discussion. But there should be a way not to be so black and white with this, right? Shouldn't there be a way where we can get some equal outcome and we don't have to be so dogmatic in saying we never have equal outcome or we never have, or we should, you see what I mean? Like there's got to be a gray zone in here somewhere.
I will totally, yes. And I love that you brought that up with Scandinavian countries, because that is something people point to all the time, and they really tried, especially in Scandinavian countries, to have an egalitarian system. Really, they tried for equality of outcome with particularly the genders, male, female. And what they realized was exactly that. They, instead of, mitigating the differences between the sexes, they heightened it. The personality differences are way greater there than they are even here, because they tried to force that and impose this equality of outcome. And a lot of it has to do with the research on it is really essentially boils down to interest. So men have a much higher propensity to have an interest in things, and women in people. Now, of course, there's always outliers. I'm not saying this is true for all men and women, but the research leans very, very strongly in a direct correlation between those two. Yeah. And that results in men wanting to be, in fields where you study things like STEM fields, and women being in fields where you want to study people. So I think that's a really good example, though, of why you can't have this equality of outcome. And we'll get back to that. We'll get back to how about like your example initially, where, you have all these people applying for the job, right? So the big problem with it is you want equality of opportunity, and I totally get that. And there are problems with that too, because where is the starting field, starting ground for that? That's really, equality of opportunity is about starting ground. It's about everybody being able to enter the race. Yep. And at what point does that start is a very nuanced conversation, and I don't have the answer for that. I don't think anybody has really come up with the answer for that just yet. But that equality of outcome does not work. And the reason for that, no matter how good the intentions are, I really do understand the intentions in that and wanting that and thinking that is giving equal opportunity, but it's not equal opportunity, because when you're trying to decide, like you said, the best person for the job, like if you were the best person for the job up against, all these different demographics, but you said, but the job, if everybody's equally qualified, should go to one of these minority groups. The problem is, like, where does the division stop, right? Because the one thing postmodernists did get right is there's an infinite number, right? Yeah. So we're looking at disadvantages is really what we're looking at. So you could say, so what are these disadvantages that we're trying to prop up and level out, right? Because people are not equal. That's just a very unfortunate reality. And we want to give everybody these opportunities, but then I'll take myself as an example, right? So I have lots of different disadvantages coming into this world. Like, so how do we level the playing field for me? Do we suddenly give me 2 eyes? Are we going to give me perfect hearing? Are we going to, somehow correct all these medical complications that have certainly impacted my ability to compete in this world? There probably is no way to do that. So on the flip side of it, should we, level out the playing field by saying, oh, well, we'll give Courtenay the job because she's quote unquote disabled, she meets this quota, there's lots of incentives to do that from, the monetary, and political side of it. So we'll give her the job. But what if I'm not really the most qualified person to do the job? And there's also this, you know, uh, there is an emotional and moral implication to that, because now other people don't necessarily know if I was really qualified for it. I may be,
Mhm.
but they don't know because I fit a quota. And you
Yeah.
were giving me an affirmative action kind of protocol to give me the advantage, so to speak. And then there's also, I have this questioning of, can I really do this job, or did they just give it to me?
Yeah.
And that, certainly affects how I'm going to perform.
I
So
think
you
that's
see
why
it
you.
from both
Yeah.
externally.
I think that's why you
So
have to me, that's why I say you have to base it on, I definitely do not think, and I know there's people who would argue this, and that's why we're having this discussion. It's fine if you're listening to this and you would argue this, it's fine. It's just a debate. I would argue that just what you
yeah,
said, it has to be that you are the most qualified to get the job, and whoever that is should do that. But when you're equally qualified, I do think there should be, what's the word, that there should be deference to people who are minorities or not represented in that company. Here's an example, and I'm glad you brought yourself up. So just so you know, if you're listening to this, you definitely have to check out Courtenay's story, because you may not know from watching her. She's blind in one eye. She has hearing issues. She has multiple issues because she was, born with many, many disabilities. And I would say it was her story is amazing. So we have to do that on the next time we talk, so everyone gets your story. But definitely go check out her story. But here's the interesting thing about you, and we're running out of time here because I got another call coming up. And what I may do is we'll do another one of these and chop this and then add you in later. And but here's the thing that I think is interesting. When you were coming up with your disabilities as a little kid, right? Your parents, specifically your mom, got you help. They put you in a sandbox. They did certain things so that you could catch up. Now, in my mind, that's how I think we should be looking at society. We should be giving society, to the degree that we can, and I agree it's messy, the degree that we can, we should level the playing field. Here's what it would be like, and then I'll get your thoughts on this, and then we can end and come back to this discussion next time. But to me, if you're running a marathon race, right, equal opportunity is not just starting at the starting line. To me, equal opportunity is essentially saying, let's not, for example, the way I see the race run, imagine we're all running this race, but as you're running this race, there's somebody who has a BB gun who's shooting the BBs at just the females in the group. Or before you run the race, all the black people have to run barefoot, right? Or only half of them have, sort of the right shoes. Or there's people, who are in the way, setting up detours only for the Asian Americans and trying to, get them off track. Or every time you stop and get water, the African Americans are given, half the amount of water. Now, I know that Courtney's probably going to argue these points, but I feel like this is what we have done with society, with some of these hitting laws, implicit biases, all these things that go on. And so in reality, we might think everyone's starting at the race. We might think they're running the same course, but along the way, there's potholes and traps and disadvantages that the runners with the nice shoes, with the gel packs, with the great music in their ears, with the perfect, sort of stuff, they get to do this because and to me, I'm not saying everyone should run with the right shoes and everything else. I'm saying that we make sure, if we're all running the race, that at least we have a base level of that there's not a group that is being actively um, sort of held back. I think that's sort of where someone like me comes from. And I definitely don't see myself, I don't like the left or the right in extreme. I do see myself as middle and slightly left in terms of, I just don't think that somebody like, for you as someone who had all these disabilities, I do want to see that you are given the things within reason that can help you reach your full potential, instead of having obstacles in your way so where you can't reach your full potential. And I think that's a gray zone argument, but I'll get your sort of points on that. And then what we'll do is we'll say, okay, let's stop there and pick up in our next discussion and actually start further with this discussion, because I know I'm not giving you near the amount of time to have this debate in full.
Absolutely, yes. I'll do my best to be concise. So I really appreciate where you're coming from with this. I really do. And I think that, for most people who want this, it's coming from a good place. The problem is, how do we adjudicate, right? Because we can't account for all the disadvantages and all the supposedly challenged or hindered groups that there are. There's an infinite number. I mean, where does it stop? Should attractiveness be one? Should height be one? Should race be one? There's so many groups. And that's one of the first problems. The next problem is that, let's say we were to be able to find a way that we're going to prop everybody up so that they are, not at the same place on the starting line, but that people have been buttressed, let's say that we magically found this formula, which, by the way, is impossible because there is something called the Pareto principle, which I won't go right into now, but which explains a great deal why that's really impossible. But we'll just really simply talk about there is genetic components that even if you were to try and give everybody these advantages, so to mitigate against whatever disadvantages they have, you still wouldn't have this equal outcome, because there are just realities of differences between people. And I think one of the fundamental philosophical differences here is that there's, power hierarchies versus competence hierarchies. And I think that, in the Western civilization, and capitalism in particular, we've really highlighted competence hierarchies, which I think is a really great thing, because it allows for the best person to succeed. However, the problem with that is that there are tremendous unfair advantages with people, and I'll talk about one that is probably not going to be very popular with people. It is kind of a touchy, subject, and understandably so. The literature on this is not conclusive, and it's very unfair. But the highest predictor of success, in the Western civilization are twofold. It's IQ and conscientiousness. And I think the statistics are something like 26% for IQ and 9% for conscientiousness. So certainly it's not a guarantee. There are lots of other variables, absolutely. And, we can argue about the quantification of those measurements, but the literature is pretty extensive on both of those. And what does that mean? It means that typically, there's always exceptions, but typically let's say in the workforce, the smartest and hardest working person is going to get the furthest. And that, has a lot of value. It's a meritocracy. So I think the problem, though, is that people don't like that because there does breed inequality. And, people want to somehow mitigate against this inequality that occurs. And the problem then occurs, there is also, and I think this will be something, that it'll be very interesting to you, so we just think about human nature. I always talk about how, and I think Viktor Frankl had a really great quote that, what human beings don't need attentionless state. We need, a cause worth striving for.
Yeah.
And this is really true. I always say that, if we have too much challenge as individuals and as a species, we die, literally. This is a biological fact. If we have too little challenge, though, we also die.
Same.
I always say you're either evolving or devolving. There is no stagnancy in, the human experience. You are always going in one direction or the other. So there is this desire to kind of make things so that everybody can, succeed, so to speak. And the way to do that, they want to level out the playing field. But it's mostly because they want to wipe out the inequality that occurs. And that doesn't help people either, because, people need something to aim at. So, Yeah, there's a lot in there. So let me go. Yeah.
Yeah, and so when you all listen to this, you'll probably see us pick up but I'll sort of leave it at this and simply say, just to kind of further the discussion for next time, because I personally don't believe in once I feel obstacles have been removed, then I feel like inequality is absolutely still going to be a reality regardless. And so I think I agree with you there. I just look at it like I do feel like certain groups, which and with Courtenay can talk about this next time. I personally feel like certain groups have been purposely put obstacles in front of them, but I also agree, once you remove those obstacles, which for me, I'm for removing those obstacles where we can spot them, and I know that's a complex sort of idea, but once you remove those obstacles, doesn't mean equal outcome. And that's how come then we all just run the race from an equal place, and at that point, then it comes down to our smarts, our conscientiousness, our ability to rise again from stressful events and fears and failures. And so to me, I think I start to see, I don't know if you guys have seen it, but at least whenever I talk to Courtney, I start to see the sort of merging. We are in this gray zone in a sense. And if you keep going, to me, I go, I'm not for then equal outcome that all of a sudden everyone has to finish the race at the same. Because I do agree that as much as I would love that, and we think it's a great idea, it's just not reality, nor does it serve our species, and it never sort of has. We need something to strive for, the competitive nature of us, the ability to win, the ability to lose, even the fact that losing teaches. It's just, for me, I go, we can't have groups of people, forget groups, we can't have individuals who might share certain traits, have obstacles placed in front of them, whether we as a culture are conscious of it or not. So to me, I kind of start looking for, where are these things and how can we begin to dismantle them if possible? And I know it opens up the whole can of worms that Courtney and I will talk about before, because I think the question for us, Courtney, right, is like, it's kind of like, is it even possible to do that? And I think you're sort of arguing not really. And I'm sort of saying, yeah, I think we have to do our best, though, because I also agree it's probably not possible, but I do feel like we need to do our best. And we kind of have. But I'll give you sort of the last word, and then we're going to pick up this conversation because it's just too interesting to leave it here.
Awesome. Yes, I think that really it is a difference of thinking about, is it possible, is probably, really good question to ask. And another question is that, and I really want to address this probably next time because this is a lot to unpack, but is this idea of, well, there are groups that share these different common disadvantages, or that they've been somehow oppressed, which is really what you're getting at. And this is very much a neo-Marxist, postmodernist theory. And the reality is that there's lots of holes in whether or not they've actually been oppressed, or they are still being oppressed. That's one part of it. And then there's the other problem of, well, but how do you protect all of these different groups from being quote unquote oppressed? Because the individual is really the ultimate, I think, antidote to that. And so you need to let the individual flourish as opposed to putting people into a little group, because this is where I think intersectional politics arose out of this, because they realized you can't just have identity politics, which would be like blacks or females or disabled or whatever. It goes on and on, right? But then they realize, what happens if you have a black, Jewish, disabled female? She's in all these different groups. So now how are we going to protect her? And that's the problem, because individuals have so many more differences between them than we do between shared groups. And that's I love that.
I love that. Let's you and I pick up on that. So when you all are listening to this podcast, this is probably one long podcast, and we're going to jump into that because I think that's an important part. I love this conversation. I love sort of your brain and the way you sort of break things down. Thanks for putting up with me. And you guys can see Courtney and I have differences, but we also just like to learn from each other and have the discussion. So thank you, my friend. You're the best. And so we'll have a part 2 and probably a part 3 to this.
Yes, I love it.
Okay, I'm going to see you. I'm going to just end, and then I'll text with you later and we'll catch up.
Awesome. All right. Thank
Later.
you.
Bye.